The main atrium of Hartwell Medical Center had never been this quiet. Nearly 200 people, hospital board members, pharmaceutical donors, surgical staff in borrowed formal wear, stood holding champagne flutes they had forgotten to drink from, watching Victor Crane drag Jerome Asante across the polished terrazzo floor like he was hauling something shameful away from a clean room. Victor's grip on Jerome's collar was deliberate, slow, the kind of slow that was meant to be witnessed by every person in the room. Thief. Victor's voice carried to the far end of the atrium without effort. A man with access to every restricted corridor in this building, and he used it to steal from the family that built it. Jerome said nothing. He kept his jaw set and his eyes fixed somewhere ahead of him, the way a man holds himself when he understands that anything he does will be used to confirm what has already been decided about him. Victor reached up with both hands and yanked the back of Jerome's collar. The fabric tore from his left shoulder in a single clean motion. What it revealed stopped the room completely. A burn scar, wide and raised, running from Jerome's left shoulder blade down toward the base of his spine. The pattern pressed into the skin like the ghost of a steel grate, fused there by heat and time, and something no one in this atrium had ever been told about. From the far side of the room, Dr. Diana Foley went completely still. She had seen that scar before, 8 years ago in a burning hallway on the back of the man who had carried her out alive. If this is your first time here, this channel is called Echoes of Memory, and it exists to tell stories about people who carry their heaviest things in silence. Not because they are weak, but because silence was the price they paid to keep the people they loved standing. Subscribe before you scroll past. What comes next matters. Jerome Asante woke every morning at 5:20. He made one lunch. Chloe was old enough now to want to make her own, though she never quite remembered to, and he set her inhaler on top of her school bag, where she couldn't leave without touching it. That was Jerome's method with most problems. He solved them quietly ahead of time, so they never became anyone else's burden. He was 43 years old and had been doing it that way for most of his adult life. After his wife Pauline passed from complications following her third cardiac surgery, when Chloe was 7, the quiet became less a habit and more a necessity. There was no one left to divide the weight. Not the rent on the apartment in Hamilton's Lower East End, not the remaining treatment debt, not the cost of Chloe's pediatric cardiac appointments, not the surgical waiting list she had been on for 18 months. Jerome carried all of it the same way he carried everything else, without commentary and without asking anyone to notice. He worked as a senior facilities technician at Hartwell Medical Center, a private hospital occupying a converted heritage building on the edge of the city's medical district. Contract work, which meant no benefits, no job security, and a laminate badge that read contractor in block letters, just in case anyone forgot. His knowledge of building systems, fire suppression infrastructure, and pharmaceutical-grade HVAC went well beyond what his title suggested. He had never mentioned that to anyone. He wore long sleeves every day, even through July, and he changed in the utility room when his shift began. Nobody on staff knew about the scar on his back, nobody asked, and Jerome did not offer. 8 years earlier, he had been a maintenance lead at Riverside Clinic, a mid-sized private medical facility across the city. In the 2 months before the accident, he had submitted separate incident reports. A HVAC at fault in the pharmaceutical storage annex, a suppression line that had been capped off during a renovation and never reconnected, and a gas valve assembly showing irregular pressure readings during weekly checks. He filed each report through the proper internal channels and waited for a response. No response came. The gas ignition happened on a Wednesday evening in November. It moved the way these things always move when the systems designed to stop them have already been disabled, fast and without apology. Most staff made it out through the main exits. Dr. Diana Foley, who was completing a fellowship residency at the clinic, did not. Jerome went back in. He found her in the East Service corridor, cut off by smoke and a collapsed ceiling panel. He got her onto his back and moved through the hallway as it came apart around him. A steel structural bracket, heated past its rated tolerance, fell from the ceiling rack and came down across his back. He did not stop moving. He pushed Diana through the emergency exit at the end of the corridor and collapsed on the other side of the threshold. It took 18 minutes before anyone pulled him out. He spent 5 weeks in hospital. He had 2 surgeries. When he was discharged, Victor Crane, who had been the clinic's chief operating officer at the time, was waiting in the lobby with a document and a warning. The document was a non-disclosure agreement. The warning was simple: or face a formal finding that the HVAC and suppression faults had been caused by unauthorized technician interference. Victor had already arranged for the incident report to be reattributed. Jerome's 4 original submissions had been reclassified as verified complaints and quietly archived. Pauline was 4 months pregnant with Chloe when Jerome signed. He had no income, no savings left after the surgeries, and no realistic path through a legal system that would bury him in motions while Pauline's condition progressed. He accepted the settlement, moved across the city, and spent the 8 years that followed making sure his daughter never had to know what nothing felt like. He never talked about Riverside Clinic, not to anyone. The discovery happened on a Tuesday night 3 weeks after Jerome had started his current contract at Hartwell. He was running a scheduled maintenance check on the pharmaceutical storage wing when he noticed the pressure readings on 2 monitoring panels were inconsistent. The sensors reported normal operating levels. When he physically checked the corresponding units, both had been decoupled from the reporting system. The equipment was running outside its rated parameters. The data said everything was fine. Jerome pulled the maintenance logs for the preceding 8 months. The same pattern appeared across 11 separate units. Safety-rated suppression components listed on the procurement invoices had been substituted with cheaper alternatives. Several inspection certifications had been signed off on dates when the wing had not yet been commissioned. Someone had been falsifying the compliance record for a long time, and doing it carefully enough that a standard audit would have missed it entirely. He copied everything to a personal storage drive and planned to bring it directly to Dr. Foley the following morning, bypassing the chain of management that sat between them. He had read enough about the new CMO in the hospital newsletter to know she had been pushing for an independent safety review of the facility's older infrastructure. She would understand what she was looking at. While pulling archive compliance files from the building's legacy server infrastructure, he noticed something else: a backup unit from the original Riverside Clinic installation. Old hardware, never decommissioned, running quietly in a rack in the utility room at the rear of the wing. It was not listed on any current schematic. Jerome noted it and moved on. Victor Crane had monitoring access to every system in the building. By the following morning, he knew Jerome had been in the archive network. He understood immediately what that meant, not just for the current falsified records, but for everything those records connected back to. If Jerome reached Diana with that data, the investigation would not stop at the present-day violations. It would go backward, 8 years backward. Victor moved first. The annual Hartwell Gala raised money for the hospital's pediatric cardiac program. It was held in the main atrium every year, the same atrium where Chloe's name sat on a surgical waiting list. There were donors, board members, physicians who had dressed up for the occasion, and a display case near the entrance holding a collection of the hospital's founding artifacts. Early instruments, framed photographs, and the personal surgical kit of Dr. Albert Hartwell himself, a velvet-lined brass case that had been in the hospital's care for 60 years. Victor removed the smallest instrument from the case that afternoon, a bone-handled lancet no longer than Jerome's palm. He walked it down to the sub-level facilities corridor and slipped it into the front pouch of Jerome's kit bag, while Jerome was completing a ceiling check on the floor above. He then ordered a security sweep of all contract personnel before the gala began, citing a protocol update. The lancet was found in Jerome's bag in front of nearly 200 people. Jerome's prints were already on the display case glass from a light fixture repair he had done in the atrium 2 weeks earlier. Victor provided a segment of security footage, digitally adjusted, showing Jerome standing in front of the case for nearly 40 seconds on the morning of the gala. The storage drive Jerome had used to copy the safety records was gone from his bag. Victor had taken it during the same window he used to plant the lancet. At the gala, Victor did not wait for a private conversation. He announced to the assembled guests that a contract worker with documented financial difficulties had used his building access to steal an irreplaceable piece of the hospital's heritage. He said it slowly. He said it the way a person says something they want to become a record. Jerome stood in the middle of the atrium and understood exactly what had happened to him. The frame was clean. The drive with the safety data was gone. If he tried to explain what he had actually been doing in the archive room, he would have to explain why he had accessed Riverside Clinic records. And that conversation would end with Victor producing the agreement Jerome had signed 8 years ago. He said nothing. He kept his eyes forward and waited. Victor walked him across the atrium, one hand on Jerome's collar, slow enough that every person in the room had time to register every step. Jerome did not resist. He matched the pace and kept his face still, because he had spent 8 years understanding that a black man who raises his voice in a room full of people who have already settled on a conclusion does not get heard. He gets confirmed. He stayed quiet until Victor called him a desperate father, until Victor said, in front of 200 people, that a man with a sick child and no options would steal anything to stay ahead of the debt. "Don't bring my daughter into this." Jerome said it once, flat final. He pulled his arm free. Victor grabbed his collar with both hands and yanked. The fabric tore from his shoulder in one motion. The scar was exposed to the entire room, raised and wide, patterned like the underside of a structural grate, pressed permanently into the skin from shoulder blade to spine. Diana was standing at the edge of the crowd. She went completely still. She had seen that scar once before, 8 years ago in a smoke-filled corridor, looking up from the back of a man who was still moving even as the ceiling came apart above him. She had felt the moment of impact, heard the exact sound the steel made when it landed. She had not been able to do anything except feel the man beneath her keep going, until cold air hit her face and the floor changed and he went down. She had never known his name. She crossed the atrium floor. Let him go. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The security personnel released Jerome. Victor started to speak. Diana did not look at him. She looked at Jerome and said, "You were at Riverside Clinic the night of the fire." It was not a question. Jerome met her eyes. "You made it out," he said. "That was the only thing that mattered." Diana held his gaze for a moment, and then she understood, fully, completely, what she was looking at. The man standing in the middle of her hospital with a torn shirt and a security escort was the man who had carried her out of a burning building, and someone had put a stolen lancet in his kit bag to make sure he never had the chance to tell anyone what he knew. Jerome did not ask her for anything. He said, "If you only look into the lancet, you're going to miss what's actually about to put this hospital on the front page." Diana turned to the head of security and ordered the pharmaceutical storage wing sealed immediately. She directed that Jerome be held on site as a witness rather than released to the police. She authorized an internal review to begin the following morning. Victor watched all of it from across the room. His expression did not change. But he had already started calculating what it would take to make sure neither of them walked away from this intact. The evidence, laid out in sequence, looked damning. Security logs showed Jerome passing the artifact display 4 times in the 72 hours before the lancet disappeared. His prints were on the case glass. The adjusted footage showed him standing in front of it for over 3 seconds on the morning of the gala. Diana's internal review team came back to her with the same conclusion the atrium full of witnesses had already reached. It looked like Jerome had done it. She did not accept the conclusion. She also could not disprove it yet. What she could do was keep the storage wing sealed and make sure no one touched the legacy server infrastructure until she understood what Jerome had been trying to tell her. That bought her time. It also gave Victor the opening he needed. He went to the board the following morning. He told them Diana was allowing a personal debt to compromise her judgment, that she was protecting a contract employee accused of theft because of an emotional attachment to an event from 8 years ago. 3 board members who had been quietly receiving consideration from the falsified procurement contracts understood immediately what Victor was actually protecting, and they voted accordingly. By Thursday afternoon, Diana had been temporarily suspended from her executive authority pending a confidence review. Victor released the atrium security footage to a regional news outlet that same evening. By Friday morning, the headline read, "Contract Worker Steals Hospital Heirloom at Charity Gala." Chloe found out at school before Jerome could warn her. 2 kids in her class had seen the story on a parent's phone. By lunch, it had moved through the building the way these things move among 10-year-olds, fast, imprecise, and designed to wound. A parent from Chloe's cardiac care cohort sent a formal letter to the pediatric program coordinator that afternoon, requesting that Chloe be removed from the surgical priority list on the grounds that a child whose parent was under criminal investigation should not retain access to resources intended for families in good standing. Jerome was sitting at the kitchen table when Chloe came home. She dropped her backpack by the door and stood there for a moment. Then she asked, "Did you take it, Dad?" Jerome looked at his daughter. He did not look away. and he did not soften the answer to make it easier to carry. "No," he said, "I did not." Chloe nodded, the way a child nods when she wants to believe something and is deciding whether she does. She picked her backpack up and went to her room without another word. Jerome sat at the table for a long time after that. He had been in rooms that were on fire. He had been in corridors with no ceiling and no forward path. He had never found a moment harder than watching his daughter walk away from him carrying that particular expression on her face. Diana came to him the next morning, not through legal counsel, not through an intermediary. She came herself to the apartment in Hamilton's Lower East End where Jerome and Chloe had been living since the building suspension made returning to work impossible. She stood in the doorway and told him she had spent the night going through the Riverside Clinic records. Jerome stepped aside and let her in. She told him what she had found: the hospital file confirming his injuries, the burn classification, the surgical record, the physiotherapy discharge notes, and the 4 incident reports he had filed in the weeks before the explosion, each one stamped received by Victor's department. None of them escalated, none of them acted on. She told him she was sorry. She said it without qualification, and then she waited. Jerome was quiet for a moment. He was standing near the window, and he did not look at her when he spoke. He said that when it happened, Pauline was 4 months along with Chloe. He had no income, no savings left after the surgeries, and no realistic way to fight a legal team that could outlast his recovery by years. He had understood then that the choice wasn't really between fighting and giving up. The choice was between his family surviving and a principle that nobody with actual power in that situation was going to honor anyway. He signed the agreement and moved forward. Then he looked at her directly and said, "But the suppression lines in that storage wing have been decoupled the same way they were capped off at Riverside. And if the wrong fault trips the wrong assembly in there, this hospital isn't going to be writing checks to settle anything. It'll be writing obituaries." Diana did not respond immediately. She looked at him, not with the weight of a debt she owed him, but with the full attention of someone hearing another person clearly for the first time. She asked why he had taken a contract at Hartwell at all after everything. He said the rate was better than anything else he had been offered that month, and that Chloe's surgical priority threshold had a financial component he had been trying to meet for over a year. Sometimes the answer was that simple. He had not known Victor would still be operating here. He had not known Diana had been appointed CMO. He had just needed the work. She nodded. She understood that kind of answer, the kind that left no room for anything symbolic. Just a man doing what it took to keep things moving. She told him she intended to commission an independent inspection of the storage wing and prepare a full disclosure of the Riverside cover-up, including what Victor had done and what the clinic's ownership had agreed to in order to keep it quiet. He told her to make the disclosure complete, not just Victor's role, all of it. She did not argue. It was the first moment in all of it that they spoke to each other without the structure of what had happened between them, without the fire, without the scar, without the lancet or the suspension. Just 2 people who had each been carrying something heavy for a long time, deciding what to do about what they knew. Victor moved the same day. By the time Diana had returned to the hospital and begun preparing the inspection documentation, Victor had already contacted the board again. He told them she intended to publish an account implicating the clinic's previous ownership in a suppressed workplace incident, and that she was doing it to validate a personal narrative about a man she believed had saved her life. He said it with the tone of someone expressing reluctant concern. The board voted to extend her suspension indefinitely and transfer executive authority to an interim committee. Her building access was downgraded before she reached the parking level. That same afternoon, a detective from Hamilton Police Service's Financial Crimes Unit arrived at Jerome's apartment. He explained that a storage drive containing proprietary Hartwell patient data records had been recovered from the parking structure where Jerome regularly serviced his vehicle, found wedged in a drain gap near his usual space. The theft of a heritage artifact had become the theft of protected health information. Jerome's landlord called that evening, apologetic but firm. The pediatric program coordinator called the following morning. Chloe's surgical priority placement had been suspended pending resolution of the matter. Victor sent a message through Jerome's duty solicitor contact. Precise and direct, Jerome would sign a formal withdrawal of any claims related to the storage wing or the Riverside incident and enter a guilty plea on the lancet theft. In exchange, the data breach charge would be dropped, and Chloe's surgical priority status would be quietly reinstated within 30 days. Jerome read the message twice. He was sitting in an apartment that would no longer be his in 2 weeks, with a daughter whose cardiac surgery had just been put on hold, facing charges that could result in a record, and a non-disclosure agreement that would be used against him the moment he tried to say anything publicly. The offer was designed to look like the only door left in a room where every other exit had been sealed. It was designed to look like mercy. Jerome set the message down on the table. He did not respond. The gas leak happened 4 days later. Victor used the window between Diana's suspension and the formal transfer of executive authority to quietly reactivate the pharmaceutical storage wing's ventilation and pressure systems, bypassing the closure order she had issued before her access was revoked. The suppression lines that had been decoupled for months remained decoupled. The gas valve assembly Jerome had flagged in his original reports was still running at irregular pressure. The evening shift pharmacist on the floor below texted Jerome at 9:53, confused about why her section of the building smelled of something chemical when the wing was supposed to be sealed. He called the hospital's emergency line. The automated system put him on hold. He drove to the facility. He could have kept driving. His credentials were hours from expiring. The building was technically off-limits to him, and every official in the city believed he was either a thief or a data criminal or both. Walking into that building at that hour was not a decision that was going to help Jerome Asante. It was a decision that had nothing to do with what would help Jerome Asante. He went in through the side service entrance, his credentials still functioned, and moved directly to the storage wing. He got 6 workers out before the first pressure release blew. The rupture was in the East Annex, the same quadrant where the decoupled sensors were most concentrated. The building's automated suppression system did not activate. Victor had locked the environmental control board from a remote terminal, cutting off both the automated response and the manual override that the facility's emergency protocol designated as the secondary failsafe. He then positioned himself at the incident command vehicle outside and told the arriving fire crew that the situation had been triggered by the same contract employee currently under active investigation for theft and data breach. Jerome was moving a young dispensary technician named Yael toward the utility corridor when a section of suspended ceiling came down between them and the exit. He pulled her back against the interior wall and covered her with his body as secondary debris came off the rack above. Outside, Diana arrived at the perimeter 11 minutes after the first rupture. She saw the wing and she stood at the barrier and felt the heat on her face, and she knew, without being told, exactly what had happened and exactly who was still inside. Victor had locked the control board. Jerome was trapped. And the legacy backup server from Riverside Clinic, sitting undisturbed in the utility room on the north end of the wing, not listed on any current facility schematic, was somewhere inside a building filling with combustible gas and emergency lights. Everything had arrived at the same point at the same time. Natalie was standing on the wrong side of the barrier. Victor was standing 20 feet away from her, briefing the incident commander with the composure of a man who had already written the outcome. Diana watched him for a moment. Then she walked toward him at a pace that did not suggest she planned to stop. She reached into the interior breast pocket of his jacket and took the emergency override card before he understood what she was doing. He kept it clipped there. She had seen him reach for it during a drill in her first week as CMO, and had filed the detail away without meaning to. She had a habit of noticing things about people she trusted. It had taken her too long to understand that noticing and trusting were not the same thing. Victor started to speak. She was already moving toward the building's Eastern Service entrance. The environmental control room was on the second level, accessible through a stairwell that had smoke from the first landing up. Diana pulled her jacket over her face and went up. The override card gave her access to the terminal. The board had been locked remotely, which meant unlocking it required a 6-digit credential sequence Victor had set. She tried the hospital's standard emergency override protocol. Rejected. She tried the year the hospital was founded. Rejected. She stood in front of the terminal in a smoke-filled room while the building made sounds that buildings are not supposed to make, and she thought about what she knew about Victor Crane. She entered the date of the Riverside Clinic fire. The board unlocked. She did not let herself think yet about what it meant that he had used that date as his code for the past 8 years. She hit the suppression release, opened the manual valve access to the secondary water feed, and took the radio she had lifted from the command vehicle on her way in. "Jerome," she said. Static then. "East Annex utility corridor, interior wall, yells with me." His voice was controlled, not calm exactly, but held together in the way it had been in the atrium when Victor was standing over him with both hands on his collar. The same way it had probably been in a hallway 8 years ago when the ceiling was coming down. Diana told him she had released the suppression system, that the secondary water feed would hit the East Annex in approximately 90 seconds and reduce the gas concentration in the corridor, but that the forward ceiling had already come down and the fire crews could not reach them from that direction. Jerome said, "There's a drainage tunnel access under the utility floor, panel marked T9, runs to the south exterior wall." She relayed it to the crew commander on the radio, then she told him she was coming. He said, "Diana, tell me when you have the panel open." She came down the stairwell and in through the secondary corridor. The suppression system was running. She followed the utility markers on the wall until she reached the T section and found them. Yael was on the ground with her back against the wall, her right arm held against her chest where falling conduit had struck it. Jerome was crouched beside her, a strip of his jacket wrapped around her forearm. He looked up when Diana came through. Neither of them said anything. She got under Yael's right side. Jerome got under her left. The three of them moved. A secondary rack gave way above them as they reached the panel opening. Jerome turned and put his back to it. Metal came down across his shoulders, and he absorbed it and kept moving, and Diana did not stop and did not look back because he did not stop, and she understood that the only thing she could do for him right now was keep going. They came out through the drainage tunnel on the south side of the building, into night air and emergency lights, and a crew already positioned at the tunnel exit because she had told them exactly where to be. Yael was taken immediately. Jerome sat down on the pavement with his back against the exterior wall, forearms on his knees, head down, and breathed. Diana sat down next to him on the concrete and did the same. Victor had moved to the far side of the command vehicle when he saw them emerge. She could see him recalibrating, micro-adjustments in his posture, in his positioning, the particular way a person rearranges a story in real time to absorb a fact that wasn't supposed to happen. She didn't give him the time. She walked directly to the incident commander and the two officers at the perimeter and laid out what she had found. The remote lock sequence. The timestamp showing the board had been locked from Victor's registered terminal 4 hours before the rupture, the suppression override. A man who claims a gas leak was triggered by someone else does not lock the suppression system before the leak begins. Then she told them about the backup server. The Riverside unit was in the north utility room, away from the worst of the rupture, covered by the suppression system she had unlocked. When the hazmat crew went in with a data recovery unit, the server was intact. The server logs confirmed Jerome's excess queries had been limited to archived compliance records, not patient data, not proprietary systems, nothing that matched the data breach charge. It also contained Jerome's 4 original incident reports from Riverside Clinic, each one stamped received by Victor Crane's department. None of them escalated, all of them buried. The same reports that should have prevented the first fire. The same pattern that had been running inside Hartwell's pharmaceutical wing for the past 14 months. The control board's access log did the rest. It showed Victor's terminal locking the suppression system. It showed the timeline. It showed everything in the order it had actually happened. Victor was arrested at the perimeter before the emergency crews had finished their sweep. He was standing near the command vehicle when the officers came to him, maintaining the expression of a man who expected a clarification momentarily. He said Diana had exceeded her suspended authority. He said the data she was citing had been obtained without proper protocol. He said Jerome Asante was a documented subject in 2 active investigations, and that anything connected to him should be treated accordingly. The officers listened. Then they put on the handcuffs. It happened in the emergency vehicle bay, in front of the fire crews, in front of the donors and staff who had been evacuated and were still standing at the barrier watching. 200 people had watched Victor Crane drag Jerome Asante across the floor of this hospital 4 days ago. Most of them were still close enough to see this. Nobody said a word, they just watched. The formal charges came the following week. criminal negligence, evidence tampering, defamation, fraud, deliberate disabling of mandated safety systems, and criminal endangerment. 3 board members referred for investigation to the Ontario Securities Commission resigned before the week was out. Victor's sentencing, when it came 8 months later, included 31 months on the criminal negligence count alone. And that was before the civil proceedings from the families of workers who had been inside the wing that night. Diana's suspension was nullified by the remaining board majority within 48 hours of Victor's arrest. She called a full hospital meeting in the main atrium, the same floor. She stood at the center of it without notes and without a podium, and she said, "A man was called a thief in this room because we accepted the words of someone with authority over the evidence of someone without it. That did not happen because we are cruel people. It happened because we did not ask the right questions. I am asking them now, and I will keep asking them." She said Jerome had not been cleared because he once carried the hospital's CMO out of a burning building. He had been cleared because the evidence proved he had done nothing wrong. She said the distinction mattered, and that Hartwell would operate from this point forward as though it did. From the side of the room, Yael, arm in a sling, began to clap. A few others joined, then more. A senior physician who had stood in the atrium 4 days ago and said nothing walked over to Jerome after the meeting and said, "I should have spoken up, so I'm sorry I didn't." Jerome accepted it with a nod. He did not make it into more than it was, and he did not make it into less. Chloe's surgical priority status was reinstated the next day. The program coordinator called Jerome directly to apologize. Chloe was scheduled for surgery within 6 weeks. The school sent a formal written apology. Jerome read it once, set it on the counter, and did not discuss it further. When Chloe asked if everything was going to be all right, he told her yes, and that they would be moving to a better apartment at the end of the month, and that her surgery date had been confirmed. Chloe said okay. Then she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I always knew you didn't take it." Jerome looked at her. "I heard you," she said. "That night, after I went to my room. You were just sitting there at the table and you were so quiet, and I knew. I've always been able to tell the difference between when you're sad and when something isn't fair. That night it was the second one." He didn't say anything for a long moment. "Go do your homework," he said finally. She went. But before she turned the corner to her room, she looked back at him once. The look of a child who has understood something important and decided to hold it carefully. He saw it. He let it be what it was. Diana offered full financial restitution. Lost wages, the original coerced settlement, medical costs the Riverside Agreement had never actually covered. Jerome accepted reimbursement for the medical expenses directly attributable to the fire. He declined everything else. He told Diana he did not want to be compensated for something that should never have happened to him. What he wanted was a safety oversight division, independently operated, with direct reporting authority to the board and legal protection for any employee, staff or contractor, who filed a complaint. He wanted it staffed by people who actually understood building systems and pharmaceutical infrastructure, not people who understood how to make paperwork look compliant. Diana said yes before he had finished. She asked him to lead it. He said he would, because it was the work he was qualified for, not because it closed any arc she needed closed. 8 months later, the Riverside Clinic building was operational again, not as a medical facility. As a regional training center for facilities technicians, junior biomedical engineers, and first-year hospital infrastructure staff from across southern Ontario. The East Annex, where the original fire had started, was now a classroom. Jerome ran the certification program. He stood in front of each new cohort without long sleeves. The scar was there, visible when he turned to the board, visible when he reached up to point at a diagram. He did not reference it. He did not need to. He taught them how to read a pressure monitoring panel, how to identify a forged inspection signature, and how to submit a safety report through a channel that could not be blocked by a single person with the right system access. He told them that last part was not a procedural detail, it was the reason all of it existed. Chloe sat in the front row at the opening session and did not take her eyes off her father for the entire hour. Afterward, Diana found Jerome in the corridor outside the main room. She was holding the velvet-lined brass lancet case returned by Hamilton police following Victor's arraignment. She held it out to him. He looked at it for a moment, then shook his head. "That belongs to the history of this place," he said. "All I need is for my daughter to know her father never stole a thing." Diana held the case a moment longer. Then she carried it to the entrance of the building, where a small permanent installation had been mounted near the door, a memorial display for the workers injured or displaced in the Riverside fire, and a framed copy of each of the 4 incident reports filed by a junior technician in the weeks before the explosion. Each one stamped received. None of them acted on. She set the Lancet case on the shelf beside them. Jerome stood in the doorway and watched her set it down. The reports were there with his name and the dates and the warnings that nobody had answered. Anyone who walked through that door could read them. That was enough. That was the only thing he had ever actually needed. Not the money, not the acknowledgement, not even the particular satisfaction of watching Victor Crane be walked out of that parking lot in handcuffs. Though he would be lying if he said that had been nothing. He had needed the truth to have somewhere it could not be buried again. It did now. He turned and walked back down the corridor toward the classroom where the next session was about to begin, and the sound of his footsteps on the new floor was steady and unhurried, the way a man walks when he has nothing left to hide. There are people who carry their heaviest things without a word for years, not because no one would have listened, but because the cost of speaking was more than they could afford, and the people they loved needed them to stay on their feet. Jerome never asked to be seen. He asked for the truth to have somewhere it could live. That is the only thing worth holding on to. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Echoes of Memory. There are more stories like this one waiting for you here.